3 days before Christmas, a woman stepped off a train into a frozen wasteland to marry a stranger, and neither of them knew if they'd survive the winter together. Ethan Cole stood on that wind-scarred platform, watching the Iron Beast crawl through the Montana snow, carrying a decision he couldn't take back. Inside one of those cars was a woman who'd answered his desperate advertisement, trading everything she knew for a future with a man she'd never met. When the train doors opened and Lydia Moore emerged, small bag, steady eyes, no tears, the bitter cold wasn't the only thing that made him shiver. If you want to see how their impossible choice becomes the fight of their lives, stay until the end. And hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The platform shuddered as the locomotive exhaled its final breath of steam into the December twilight. Ethan Cole shifted his weight from one boot to the other, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his wool coat, fingers curled against the cold that seemed to reach straight through leather and fabric to freeze the doubt in his bones. Around him, the small station town of Benson Ridge dissolved into the early darkness, a collection of wooden buildings hunched against the wind like old men trying to shield a dying flame. Snow had been falling since morning, not the gentle Christmas card variety, but hard, mean flakes that stung exposed skin and promised worse to come. He shouldn't be here. That thought had circled his mind for 3 weeks, ever since he'd sent the final letter confirming the arrangement, ever since Margaret Sullivan, the schoolteacher who ran the matrimonial correspondence service, had handed him Lydia Moore's last response with a knowing look that made him want to ride straight back to his cabin and forget the whole damn thing. "She's committed, Mr. Cole," Margaret had said, her fingers stained with ink from a dozen similar letters she'd processed that week. "Left Boston 4 days ago, be in Montana by the 22nd, just like she promised." The 22nd. Today. Ethan pulled one hand free to brush snow from his beard, a nervous gesture he'd developed over the past hour of waiting. He was 34 years old, owned 200 acres of decent grazing land, had 40 head of cattle that had survived last winter, and a cabin that was 3/4 finished. Walls solid, roof tight, but the interior still raw in places where he'd prioritized function over comfort. What he didn't have was a reason to finish that cabin. Not for himself alone. 5 years he'd worked this land. 5 years of talking to horses and cattle, of cooking meals for one, of watching the sun set over the valley with nothing but his own thoughts for company. His nearest neighbor was 7 miles south, a family man named Thomas Reed with a wife and 3 children who made their small homestead feel like a kingdom compared to Ethan's silent acre. Last spring, sitting at the Reeds' dinner table, an annual invitation he both dreaded and cherished, he'd watched Thomas's wife, Anne, serve stew to her laughing children, watch Thomas catch her hand as she passed and squeeze it with casual intimacy, and something had broken open inside Ethan's chest. Not jealousy exactly, more like recognition of an absence so profound he'd taught himself not to notice it. On the ride home that night, under stars so bright they seemed to mock his solitude, he'd made the decision that led him to this frozen platform. The mail-order advertisement had felt desperate even as he'd written it. Rancher, 34, seeks wife for Montana homestead. Must be hardy, practical, willing to work. Comfort and security offered in exchange for companionship and partnership. He'd agonized over every word, crossing out lonely 3 times before settling on companionship, striking through love, because that seemed like a promise he had no right to make. Margaret had assured him the phrasing was fine, that dozens of women back east were looking for exactly what he offered. A fresh start, honest work, a man who wouldn't beat them or drink away the earnings. The bar was apparently that low. Lydia Moore's first letter had arrived 6 weeks later, in September, when the valley still glowed gold and the work of preparing for winter hadn't yet turned brutal. Her handwriting was careful, educated, each letter precisely formed as if she'd thought about the weight of every word. "Mr. Cole, I am writing in response to your advertisement in the Matrimonial News. I am 26 years old, unmarried, and currently employed as a seamstress in Boston. I have no family remaining in the city and limited prospects here. Your offer of partnership on a Montana homestead interests me greatly. I should be forthright about my circumstances. I was previously engaged, but that arrangement ended badly and left me in a position where remaining in Boston is neither practical nor desirable. I'm not fragile, though I'm also not experienced in ranch work. I learn quickly and I do not give up easily. I ask only for honesty and respect. I can offer the same, along with skills in sewing, basic cooking, reading, and figures. If you believe we might suit, I would welcome further correspondence. Respectfully, Lydia Moore. That phrase, that arrangement ended badly, had stayed with him. Most women's letters either glossed over their pasts entirely or invented romantic fictions about seeking adventure. Lydia's bluntness felt like trust, or at least the foundation of it. They'd exchanged 4 more letters over the following months. His had been awkward, full of practical details about the ranch, the climate, the isolation. Hers had been measured and intelligent, asking questions that revealed she understood exactly what she was agreeing to. Is there a town nearby? How far? Benson Ridge, 12 miles, small, general store, church, doctor when he's sober. What happens if we find ourselves entirely unsuited? I'll pay your return fare. No questions asked. Do you expect immediate marriage, or would you prefer a period of acquaintance first? That one had stumped him. In the end, he'd written, I expect nothing except honesty. We can decide together when and if we're ready. Her final letter, arriving 3 weeks ago, had been brief. Mr. Cole, I will arrive in Benson Ridge on December 22nd on the 4:17 train from Billings. I will be carrying a brown leather bag and wearing a gray coat. I hope you will be there to meet me, but if you have changed your mind, I will understand and make other arrangements. Until then, Lydia. I hope you will be there had cut deeper than she could have known. The train whistle shrieked, yanking Ethan back to the present. The great iron beast was slowing now, its wheels grinding against frozen rails, steam billowing into the darkening sky. Along the platform, a handful of other people had gathered. Merchants expecting shipments, a family reunion in progress, an old man who seemed to meet every train whether he expected anyone or not. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. The passenger car doors opened. A porter stepped down first, then turned to help descend a woman wrapped in furs. Too expensive. Wrong color. Not her. Next came a traveling salesman Ethan recognized from previous trips to town, then 2 soldiers heading home on leave, their uniforms drawing nods from the gathered crowd. Then she appeared. Gray coat, just like she'd written. Threadbare at the cuffs, he noticed, but clean and well-maintained. She was smaller than he'd imagined, barely reaching the porter's shoulder, but she moved with a straight-backed certainty as she stepped onto the platform. The porter reached for her bag, the brown leather one, but she shook her head and kept her grip on it, nodding her thanks but clearly unwilling to surrender the one possession she'd carried across half a country. Her hair was dark, pulled back severely from a face that was pale with cold and maybe nerves. Not beautiful in the way of magazine illustrations, but striking, sharp cheekbones, a firm mouth, eyes that swept the platform with systematic assessment rather than panic. Those eyes found him. He knew she'd found him by the way her posture changed, straightening even more, her chin lifting slightly. For a moment that stretched into eternity, they stared at each other across 20 feet of snow-covered platform, while the other passengers swirled around them like water parting around stones. Then she walked toward him. Not hesitant, not rushing, steady, deliberate. Each step crunching in the snow, her breath visible in the frigid air, her grip on that brown bag never loosening. She stopped 3 feet away. Mr. Cole? Her voice was quieter than he'd expected, but clear. Eastern accent, educated, but with an underlying steadiness that matched her letters. Miss Moore. He pulled his hands from his pockets, suddenly aware of how rough they must look. Calloused, scarred, one thumbnail still black from a mishap with a hammer 2 weeks ago. You made it. I did. Silence expanded between them, not quite awkward, but not comfortable either. Around them, the platform was emptying as people claimed their passengers or packages and hurried toward the warm glow of the station house. She was looking at him with that same assessing gaze, and he realized he should probably say something else, something welcoming or reassuring, but his mind had gone blank. It's colder than I expected, she said finally. This is mild. The words came out before he could stop them, and he watched her eyebrows rise slightly. I mean, it'll get worse, much worse. Another month or so. I see. I brought extra blankets, he added, feeling like an idiot. For the ride. It's about 2 hours to the ranch, maybe 3 in this weather. She nodded, looking past him toward the edge of the platform where his wagon waited, hitched to two sturdy horses who stood with the patience of animals accustomed to waiting in the cold. Will we make it before dark? No. He appreciated that she'd asked. But the trail is clear enough, and the horses know it. We'll have moonlight once this cloud cover breaks. If it broke. But he didn't say that part. Then we should go. She adjusted her grip on the bag. I'm ready. Was she? Was he? But Ethan just nodded and gestured toward the wagon. This way. He walked slightly ahead, acutely aware of her footsteps behind him, the whisper of her coat against her skirts, the small sounds of her breathing in the cold air. When they reached the wagon, he turned to take her bag, and this time she let him, though he noticed how her fingers lingered on the handle for just a moment before releasing it. He set it carefully in the wagon bed, among the supplies he'd picked up earlier: flour, sugar, coffee, lamp oil, a few other necessities that would see them through the rest of winter if the snows got bad. Then he turned back to help her up onto the seat. She was already climbing up. Not gracefully, her skirts caught on the wheel spoke, and she had to yank them free. But determinedly, using the wheel and the seat edge to pull herself up without waiting for assistance. By the time Ethan moved to offer his hand, she was settled on the bench, arranging her coat and skirts with brisk efficiency. He climbed up beside her, trying not to notice how small the bench suddenly seemed with two people on it. Their shoulders were nearly touching. He could smell something faintly floral, soap maybe, or some kind of sachets packed among her clothes. You should wrap this around you. He pulled one of the heavy wool blankets from behind the seat and handed it to her. The wind picks up once we're out of town. She took it without argument, spreading it over her lap and legs. Thank you. Ethan gathered the reins, released the brake, and clicked his tongue to the horses. The wagon lurched forward, wheels crunching through fresh snow, and began its journey out of Benson Ridge toward the open country beyond. For the first mile, neither of them spoke. The town fell away behind them, its scattered lights disappearing into the darkness and swirling snow. Ahead, the trail stretched pale and ghostly between dark walls of pine forest, barely visible in the failing light. You've had this land for 5 years? Her question startled him. He'd been so focused on driving, on watching the trail and the weather, that he'd half forgotten she was there. Yes, 5 years this spring. And before that? Worked other people's ranches. Saved money. When this parcel came available, I bought it. He paused. It was cheap. The previous owner gave up after one winter. Why? Too isolated. His wife hated it. They left before spring. He felt her absorb this information, weighing it against her own decision to be here. Do you hate it? She asked. No. The answer was immediate and true. It's hard. Harder than I expected, but it's mine. That matters. Yes, she said quietly. It does. The horses plodded on, their breath steaming in the cold. Snow continued to fall, heavier now, beginning to accumulate on the blanket across Lydia's lap. Ethan knew he should probably make more conversation, ask her about her journey, about Boston, about anything that might ease the strange tension between them. But the words wouldn't come, and the silence felt less awkward than forcing pleasantries neither of them believed. May I ask you something, Mr. Cole? Ethan, you can call me Ethan. Ethan. She tested the name, then continued. Why did you wait so long to look for a wife? It was a fair question, more direct than he'd expected, but somehow fitting for a woman who'd written that arrangement ended badly in her first letter. I told myself I needed to get established first, build something worth offering, but that was partly an excuse. He kept his eyes on the trail. Mostly, I didn't think anyone would want this life. Or me. But you placed the advertisement anyway. I got tired of being alone. The honesty of it surprised him, but having started, he continued. I got tired of talking to horses, tired of cooking for one, tired of working all day with nothing to come home to except more work. And you think marriage will fix that? No. He glanced at her then, meeting those dark, serious eyes. I think partnership might, if we're both willing to work at it. She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded and looked back at the trail ahead. That's honest, at least. You asked for honesty. I did. A pause. May I be equally honest? Please. I'm afraid. The words were quiet but steady. I'm afraid I've made a terrible mistake. I'm afraid I won't be strong enough for this life. I'm afraid you'll regret bringing me here and I'll be stranded 1,000 miles from anything familiar. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself. But I'm more afraid of what my life would have been if I'd stayed. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of shared desperation dressed up as brave decision-making. The arrangement that ended badly, he said, in Boston. His name was William. Her voice remained steady, but he heard the cost of that steadiness. We were engaged for a year. 2 weeks before the wedding, I discovered he'd been keeping another woman, had been for most of our engagement. When I confronted him, he told me I should be grateful he was willing to marry me at all, given my age and lack of prospects. Jesus. I broke the engagement. He spread stories about me being unstable, difficult, ungrateful. My employer, the dress shop where I worked, let me go. Said my presence was affecting business. She brushed snow from her sleeve with precise movements. So, yes, Mr. Cole, Ethan, that arrangement ended badly, and staying in Boston meant becoming either desperate enough to accept someone like William after all, or old and poor and alone. This seemed like a third option. The horses trudged on through deepening snow. The temperature was dropping fast now that full darkness had fallen, and even through his heavy coat, Ethan could feel the cold settling into his bones. Beside him, Lydia sat straight and still, but he could see her shivering. Here. He shifted the reins to one hand and reached behind the seat, pulling out the second blanket. Add this one. You'll freeze. I'm used to it. Take it. She did, layering it over the first one, and he pretended not to notice how her shoulders relaxed slightly as the added warmth took hold. We're not so different, he said after a while. Both running from something, both hoping there's something better out here. Are we running or choosing? Does it matter? I think it might. She turned to look at him again, her face barely visible in the darkness except when the moonlight broke through the clouds. Running means we're fleeing. Choosing means we're moving toward something. And which do you think we're doing? I don't know yet. The honesty in her voice matched his own. Ask me again in spring. If they made it to spring. The thought came unbidden, and with it, an awareness of how much could go wrong in the months ahead. The cold could kill them. The isolation could break them. The sheer difficulty of survival could grind them down until there was nothing left but resentment and regret. Or they could make it, together. The cabin, Lydia said, interrupting his thoughts. You said it's 3/4 finished. What's missing? Interior walls in 2 rooms. Some of the floor needs finishing. The kitchen is functional, but basic. I built for warmth and weather resistance first. Everything else has been as time and money allowed. But it's sound? Weather tight. Yes, the roof is solid. Walls are double thick. Fireplace draws properly. You won't freeze. She corrected quietly. We won't freeze. The word hung in the cold air between them. We. Partnership. The thing they were both gambling on. We, Ethan agreed. The trail began to climb now, rising into the foothills that cupped his valley like hands holding water. The horses leaned into their harnesses, their hooves finding purchase in the snow-covered ground with the confidence of animals who'd made this journey 100 times. How much farther? Lydia asked. Another hour, maybe a bit more. She nodded and fell silent again, and Ethan let the quiet settle. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon, the jingle of harness, the soft thud of hooves in snow, and the endless whisper of wind through pine trees that crowded close on either side of the trail. He thought about what waited at the end of this journey, the cabin he'd built with his own hands, the life he'd carved out of wilderness through sheer stubborn will, the valley that could be beautiful in its starkness or brutal in its indifference, depending on the weather and the season and luck. He thought about bringing Lydia more into that life, into that space he'd occupied alone for so long, and wondering if it would feel like an invasion or a homecoming. Wondering if she'd last a week before asking for that return fare he'd promised. Wondering if he was making the same mistake the previous owner had made, thinking a woman could survive this isolation, this endless work, This fundamental loneliness that no amount of partnership might truly cure. What are you thinking about? Her question pulled him back. He considered lying, offering some pleasant fiction, but she'd asked for honesty. I'm thinking about whether I'm being selfish, bringing you out here. I'm an adult, Ethan. I made my own choice. Based on letters, not reality. And you made your choice based on letters too. She adjusted the blankets, burrowing deeper into their warmth. We're both taking a risk. That doesn't make you selfish. It makes you human. What if you hate it? Then I'll tell you. What if you hate having me here? I won't. You sound very certain. I am. He was surprised by how true it felt. Whatever happens, whatever we decide about the future, I won't regret having company, having help, having someone to talk to who isn't a horse. That drew a sound from her that might have been a laugh, soft and brief, but real. Your expectations are remarkably low, Mr. Cole. Ethan. Ethan. She said it correctly this time, without the formality. My expectations are low too. We might suit each other perfectly. The wagon crested a rise, and suddenly the valley opened before them, a wide expanse of white beneath a sky where the clouds had finally begun to break, allowing moonlight to spill across the snow in shades of silver and blue. In the distance, dark against the pale ground, stood the cabin, a single lit window glowing like an ember. There, Ethan said, pointing. Home. Lydia leaned forward, straining to see better. You left a light burning. Habit. Easier to come home to light than darkness. She didn't respond, but he felt her attention fixed on that distant glow, and he tried to see it through her eyes. Not a beacon of safety, an arrival, but the endpoint of a journey that had carried her from everything familiar into complete uncertainty. The horses, sensing the nearness of stable and hay, picked up their pace. The wagon rattled faster over the frozen ground, closing the distance between the trail and the cabin, between the past and whatever future waited. As they drew closer, details emerged. The cabin was solid, built from logs he'd cut and hauled himself. The gaps chinked tight against the wind. Smoke rose from the stone chimney. The stable stood 30 yards to the left, sturdy and dark. Beyond everything, the land rolled away into darkness, mile after mile of territory that belonged to him in name but to Winter in fact. Ethan pulled the wagon up in front of the cabin and set the brake. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Lydia spoke, her voice very quiet. It's so empty. Not the cabin. The land. The endless stretch of it, the absence of other lights, other signs of human presence. The profound isolation that Ethan had grown so accustomed to, he'd almost forgotten how it might feel to someone experiencing it for the first time. Yes, he said, because there was no point denying it. It is. How far to the nearest neighbor? Reed family, 7 miles south. And the town? 12 miles. We passed the halfway point an hour ago. She absorbed this, her eyes still fixed on the darkness beyond the cabin's small circle of light. Miss Moore. Lydia. If you want to go back, we can leave in the morning. I meant what I wrote, no questions asked. She turned to look at him then, and even in the dim light he could see something fierce in her expression. I didn't travel 1,000 miles to turn back at the first moment of doubt, Ethan Cole. I knew it would be empty. I knew it would be hard. She gathered the blankets and started to rise. I'm cold, I'm tired, and I'd very much like to see the inside of this cabin you've built. After that, we can discuss whether I'm staying or leaving. Despite everything, the cold, the uncertainty, the weight of the decision they'd both made, Ethan felt a smile tug at his mouth. Yes, ma'am. He climbed down from the wagon and came around to help her descend, but like before, she was already moving, using the wheel to climb down with careful determination. This time he didn't try to assist, just retrieved her bag and waited while she found her footing in the snow. Careful, he said as she took her first steps toward the cabin. It's icy near the door. She nodded and moved forward cautiously, her city boots clearly inadequate for this terrain. When she slipped slightly, Ethan caught her elbow to steady her, and she accepted the help without comment. He pushed open the cabin door and stepped back to let her enter first. The interior was warm. He'd banked the fire before leaving that morning, and it had kept the main room comfortably heated. The space was simple: a stone fireplace along one wall, a rough table with two chairs, a kitchen area with a cast iron stove, shelves holding supplies, and a curtain partially drawn across an alcove where his bed stood. Lydia stepped inside and stood very still, taking it all in. Ethan tried to see it through her eyes: the bare wooden walls, the simple furnishings, the complete absence of decoration or comfort beyond the purely functional. Compared to what she must have known in Boston, it probably looked like poverty. "The bed," she said finally. "There's only one right now." He set her bag down by the door. "You take it. I'll sleep out here by the fire until I can build another bed frame. Won't take more than a few days." "That's not necessary." "It is." He met her gaze. "We agreed to honesty and respect. That means you get privacy until we both decide otherwise." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you. There's water in the bucket by the stove, still warm. Coffee too, if you want it. I need to put the horses up and unload the supplies. Make yourself comfortable." He turned to go, but her voice stopped him. "Ethan?" "Yes?" "Thank you for being here, at the station. I wasn't entirely sure you would be." The vulnerability in her voice matched the phrase from her letter, "I hope you will be there." And Ethan felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of how much courage it must have taken to board that train with nothing but letters and hope to guide her. "I gave you my word," he said. "I don't break my word." "Neither do I." Their eyes held for a moment, an understanding passing between them that felt more binding than any formal agreement. Then Ethan stepped back into the cold to tend to the horses, leaving Lydia Moore, this stranger who might become his wife, his partner, his future, alone in the home he'd built for a life he'd never quite believed would include anyone but himself. Outside, the temperature continued to drop. The clouds that had broken to reveal the moon were massing again on the western horizon, dark and heavy, with the promise of more snow. A lot more snow. Ethan looked at those clouds as he unhitched the horses, reading the weather with 5 years of hard-won experience, and felt the first prickle of real concern. A storm was coming. A bad one. And it was going to arrive a lot sooner than he'd expected. The horses were restless in their stalls, stamping and tossing their heads as Ethan removed their harnesses and rubbed them down. They could sense it too. The pressure change, the electric tension in the air that preceded serious weather. He worked quickly, his hands efficient from years of practice, but his mind was already racing through calculations. Supplies in the cabin, firewood stacked against the north wall, the cattle in the near pasture, too far from shelter if the storm hit hard. He should have brought them closer yesterday when he first noticed the western sky darkening. Should have trusted his instincts instead of hoping he had one more day of clear weather to prepare. Now he'd have to make a choice: secure everything he could tonight and hope the herd survived on their own, or leave Lydia alone in the cabin while he spent hours in the freezing dark trying to move 40 head of cattle to the Windbreak Canyon a mile north. The decision wasn't really a choice at all. She'd been here less than an hour. He couldn't abandon her to face a Montana blizzard alone while he played cowboy with animals that might already be doomed. Ethan finished with the horses, made sure their water trough was full and hay racks loaded, then grabbed an armful of firewood from the stack outside the stable. The wind had picked up in just the 15 minutes he'd been working, and the first outrider flakes of the coming storm were starting to fall. Not the lazy afternoon snow from earlier, but hard pellets that stung his face and promised real violence ahead. He crossed the yard to the cabin, kicked the door open with his boot, and backed inside with the wood. Lydia was standing by the stove, holding a cup of coffee in both hands, as if trying to absorb its warmth through the ceramic. She'd removed her coat and hat, revealing a simple dark dress that had seen better days but was clean and carefully mended. Her hair was still pulled back, but a few strands had escaped to frame her face, softening the severity he'd noticed at the station. "Storm's coming," he said without preamble, dumping the wood into the box beside the fireplace. "Going to be bad." She looked toward the window where snow was already starting to streak past the glass. "How bad?" "Bad enough that I need to secure everything now. Might be 3 or 4 days before we can get outside again once it hits." He straightened, brushing bark from his coat. "I need to bring in more wood, check the shutters, make sure the stable is battened down. There's food in the larder: beans, salt pork, flour, dried apples. Enough for a week if we're careful." What can I do to help? The offer surprised him. He'd expected her to retreat to the bed, to hide from the reality of what was coming. Instead, she stood there, coffee cup lowered, her expression calm and focused. You know how to work a stove? I can learn quickly. Coffee's already made. There's cornbread from this morning. It's cold, but it's food. Eat something if you're hungry. I'll be back in 20 minutes. Then we need to talk about what happens when this storm really hits. She nodded, and Ethan pushed back out into the night. The next hour passed in a blur of frantic preparation. He hauled load after load of firewood, stacking it inside until he had enough to keep them warm for a week. He checked every shutter, every door, reinforcing the stable door with an extra crossbeam and making sure the livestock had enough feed to last. The wind kept building, and the snow that had started as scattered flakes became a steady curtain that reduced visibility to a few yards. By the time he made his final trip back to the cabin, the world had disappeared into white chaos. Inside, Lydia had been busy. The room was warmer, the fire built up properly. The table was set with 2 plates, 2 cups, and she'd managed to warm the cornbread and fry some salt pork. It wasn't much, but the simple domesticity of it, someone else setting a table, preparing food, creating the small rituals of shared life, hit him harder than he'd expected. Sit, she said, gesturing to one of the chairs. You need to eat. I need to. Whatever you need to do can wait 15 minutes. Sit. The firmness in her voice reminded him of Anne Reed, Thomas's wife, and he found himself obeying before he'd consciously decided to. He sank into the chair, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was, how the cold had seeped into his bones during the hour of work outside. Lydia set food in front of him and took the other chair. For a few minutes they ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of fire and the rising howl of wind around the cabin walls. You said 3 or 4 days, Lydia said finally. Is that normal? For December storms? Yes, we'll get 1 or 2 like this each winter, sometimes worse. He tore off a piece of cornbread. The cabin will hold. I built it to withstand this. And the animals? Your cattle? There it was, the question he'd been avoiding. They're in the near pasture, about half a mile from here. There's decent windbreak along the eastern edge, trees and rocks. If they're smart, they'll cluster there and wait it out. And if they're not smart, then we'll lose some. He met her eyes. That's ranching. Every winter takes its toll. She absorbed this with a small nod, her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup. In your letters, you said you had 40 head. Started with 25 5 years ago, built up to 40 last spring, lost 6 in last winter's storms, sold 8 in the fall to buy supplies and have cash for this. He gestured vaguely, meaning her train fare, the advertisement costs, the future he'd been trying to build. So you gambled on me instead of on more cattle. I gambled on a partner, someone to help build something that lasts beyond 1 season. He set down his fork. Cattle die. People leave, but a real partnership, if we can make it work, that's worth more than any herd. That's remarkably optimistic for a man who lives alone in the middle of nowhere. Or remarkably desperate. He allowed himself a small smile. You decide which. The wind slammed against the cabin with enough force to rattle the shutters. Lydia flinched slightly, but didn't look away from him. How bad will it really get? Honestly? I don't know. Could be we're snowed in for a few days and then it clears. Could be worse. Could be we lose the stock, lose supplies, have to make hard choices about what we can salvage come spring. He leaned back in his chair. I won't lie to you, Lydia. This is the part of frontier life that breaks people. Not the work, not the isolation, but the storms. The times when you realize how little control you actually have. Did it break the previous owner? His wife, yes. Him, he might have stuck it out, but she begged to leave. He loved her more than he loved the land. Ethan studied Lydia's face, trying to read what she was thinking. Would have been the right choice too, probably. Some people aren't meant for this. And you think I might be one of those people. I think you've been here 2 hours. I think you have no idea what you're in for. And I think I have no right to ask you to stay if this storm shows you a future you can't live with. Lydia set down her cup with a decisive click. Let me tell you what I know about storms, Ethan Cole. I know what it's like when everything you thought was solid turns out to be built on lies. I know what it's like to lose your reputation, your work, your future in the space of a single conversation. I know what it's like to be trapped in a city of 1 million people and still feel completely alone. She stood, began collecting the plates with brisk movements. So, yes, this storm is frightening. Yes, I'm terrified of what the next few days might bring. But I didn't come here expecting easy. I came here expecting real. The cabin shuddered under another gust of wind, and somewhere outside something metal clanged against wood. Probably the stable door catch, Ethan thought, though he'd secured it twice already. I need to check that, he said, rising. I'll come with you. No, I need to see it. Her voice was firm. I need to understand what we're facing, and you might need help. He wanted to argue, wanted to keep her safe inside while he handled the brutal work outside. But the set of her jaw told him she wouldn't yield, and maybe she was right. Maybe she needed to see exactly what she'd signed up for. Put on every layer you have, he said, and stay close to me. In this wind, you get turned around, you'll freeze before you find your way back. 5 minutes later, they pushed out into the storm together. The wind hit like a physical blow, driving snow into their faces with enough force to sting exposed skin. Visibility was down to a few feet. Ethan grabbed Lydia's hand, not gently, but with the iron grip of someone who knew how fast a person could disappear in whiteout conditions, and pulled her toward the stable. The door was banging in the wind, the crossbeam he'd set having worked loose. The horses inside were wild-eyed and panicked, their fear adding to the chaos. Ethan shoved Lydia toward the wall where she'd have some shelter from the wind, then fought to secure the door, his hands already going numb despite his gloves. "The crossbeam!" he shouted over the wind. "There! By your feet!" Lydia looked down, spotted the heavy piece of wood that had blown free, and bent to grab it. She could barely lift it, but she managed to drag it toward him, her whole body straining against the weight. Ethan caught it, wrestled it into place, and hammered it home with the side of his fist. The door held. Inside, the horses were still spooked but calming. Ethan moved between them, checking harnesses, speaking in low tones that probably couldn't be heard over the wind but seemed to help anyway. Lydia stood near the door, her arms wrapped around herself, watching him work. "We can't stay long," he said, rejoining her. "Too cold, but I needed to make sure they were secure." "The cattle," she said, her teeth chattering. "The ones in the pasture, can they survive this?" "Some will, some won't. That's the truth of it." "We should bring them in." "Lydia, I know I don't understand ranching. I know I'm from the city, and I don't know anything about livestock or storms or any of this." She moved closer, her voice rising to be heard over the wind. "But I understand numbers. You said you sold 8 head to afford bringing me here. If you lose half the herd in this storm, that's 20 cattle. That's years of work gone. Your whole operation could collapse. And if I go out there in this, I could die. We both could. Is that a better option?" "No, but there has to be something." A massive gust of wind hit the stable, and the entire structure groaned. The horses screamed, and for a moment Ethan thought the roof might tear off. But it held, and the wind passed, leaving them in the shaking aftermath. "Inside," Ethan said. "Now." This time Lydia didn't argue. They fought their way back across the yard, the distance of 30 yards feeling like 30 miles as the wind tried to drive them off course. When they finally stumbled through the cabin door, both of them were crusted with snow and shaking violently from the cold. Ethan slammed the door shut and threw the bolt. The sudden absence of wind felt like silence, though he could still hear it screaming around the walls. "Fireplace," he ordered, already moving. "Get warm. I'll make coffee." But Lydia grabbed his arm, stopping him. Her face was red from the cold, her eyes watering from the wind, but her expression was fierce. "Tell me there's a way to save them." "Lydia, tell me. Or tell me there isn't. But don't dismiss the question just because I'm new here." Ethan looked at her. This woman who'd stepped off a train into his life just hours ago, who had every right to hide inside and wait for the storm to pass, who instead was standing here demanding he find a way to save cattle she'd never seen because she understood what their loss would mean. "There might be a way," he said slowly. "The Windbreak Canyon. It's a mile north, sheltered on 3 sides. If I could get the herd there, they'd have a real chance. But in this storm, on foot, trying to drive 40 head through snow and wind, he shook his head. It would take hours. We'd both freeze. What if we used the horses, and what if we went now before the storm gets worse? It can't get much worse. You said 3 or 4 days. That means it's going to build for another day at least before it peaks. Right now it's bad, but it's not impossible. She moved to the window, peered out at the white chaos. In a few more hours it will be. She was right, and Ethan knew it. The storm was still in its early stages. By tomorrow, it would be a full blizzard, visibility 0, temperature dropping to where exposed skin would freeze in minutes. If they were going to move the herd, it had to be now. But the risk... I can't ask you to do that, he said. You don't know how to ride in this weather. You don't know the land. You could die out there. You're not asking, I'm offering. She turned from the window to face him. And you're right. I don't know any of those things, so you'll have to teach me fast or tell me what I can do to help. But I didn't come 1,000 miles to watch your life's work freeze to death in a field. Ethan stared at her. This fierce stranger who'd appeared in his life like an answer to a question he'd been too afraid to ask properly. In that moment, something shifted. Not love. Not yet. They were too new to each other for that. But something deeper. Recognition, maybe. The kind of partnership that gets forged in crisis when two people decide to trust each other with everything that matters. All right, he said. But we do this my way. You follow every instruction exactly. No questions. No hesitation. Agreed? Agreed. And if I say we abort, we abort. I won't sacrifice you for cattle. Fine. Now tell me what we need to do. They spent the next 15 minutes preparing with the speed of people who knew time was running out. Ethan pulled out his heavy weather gear, oilcloth coat, wool scarves, thick gloves. Lydia layered on everything she had, which wasn't much, so he gave her one of his spare coats and wrapped her hands in strips of wool that would provide some protection inside her inadequate gloves. The horses will know where to go, he explained as he worked. They've made the trip to the windbreak before. Your job is to stay on yours and help turn any cattle that break from the herd. I'll do the main driving. You just need to be a presence on the flank. The cattle see a rider, they'll stay grouped. And if I fall off? Don't. She met his eyes. That's not helpful advice. It's the only advice that matters. You fall off in this storm, I might not be able to find you, so don't fall off. He saw her swallow hard, saw the fear flash across her face, but she nodded. They left the warmth of the cabin and crossed to the stable. The horses were calmer now, though they tossed their heads and rolled their eyes when Ethan began saddling them. He chose the two most steady, Storm, his big gray gelding, and Bella, a smaller mare with a gentle disposition. This is Bella, he said, leading the mare to where Lydia stood. She's the calmest horse I own. She won't spook easily, and she knows the land. Trust her. I don't know how to ride. The confession stopped him cold. What? I mean, I've ridden, twice, in a park in Boston with a guide leading the horse. I don't actually know how to control one. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, recalculating everything. This was insane. He couldn't take someone who didn't know how to ride out into a blizzard to herd cattle. It was suicide. But looking at Lydia's face, seeing the determination there mixed with honest fear, he knew she wasn't going to back down. And he knew, with the certainty that comes from years of reading weather, that if they didn't move the herd tonight, there wouldn't be a herd come morning. All right, new plan. You ride with me. What about the second horse? We'll pony her. She follows Storm anyway. The extra presence will help with the herd. He swung into Storm's saddle, then held down his hand. Give me your hand. Put your foot on mine and swing up behind me. It took 3 tries, complicated by her skirts and the bulk of their winter gear, but finally Lydia was seated behind him on the horse, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist. Hold on hard, he said. No matter what happens, don't let go. Understand? I understand. Ethan grabbed Bella's lead rope, clicked his tongue, and urged Storm out into the storm. The wind was a living thing now, a howling beast that tore at their clothes and drove snow into every gap and opening. Visibility was almost 0. Ethan navigated by feel and memory, trusting Storm to find the trail north toward the pasture. Behind him, Lydia held on with desperate strength, her body pressed against his back, her face buried against his shoulder to escape the worst of the wind. He could feel her shaking from cold or fear or both, but her grip never loosened. It took 20 minutes to reach the pasture, 20 minutes of fighting through snow that was already knee-deep on the horse and building. When they finally found the fence line, Ethan pulled up and tried to peer through the chaos. "There!" Lydia shouted, pointing. He followed her gesture and saw them, dark shapes huddled against the far fence, the cattle clustering together for warmth and shelter that the fence line couldn't provide. They were perhaps 200 yards away, but in this storm it might as well have been miles. "We have to circle around," he shouted back. "Get behind them, drive them north. You understand?" "Yes!" Ethan urged Storm forward, skirting the pasture edge, Bella following faithfully on her lead. The cattle hadn't noticed them yet, too focused on their own survival to register the approaching horses. When they were in position, Ethan began shouting, waving one arm while keeping the other locked on the reins. The nearest cattle lifted their heads, saw the horses, and began to move. Others followed, the herd instinct kicking in despite the storm. Slowly, painfully, the dark mass began to shift northward. "It's working," Lydia shouted, but celebration was premature. A gust of wind hit them broadside, so powerful it nearly unseated Ethan. Storm planted his feet and held, but Bella spooked, jerking the lead rope so hard Ethan had to let it go or be pulled from the saddle. The mare bolted into the storm and disappeared. "No," Ethan swore, but there was nothing to be done. Going after her meant losing the herd. He had to trust she'd find her way back to the stable or to the windbreak, had to focus on the cattle that were now moving but could scatter at any moment. They drove on, pushing the herd yard by brutal yard through the deepening snow. Ethan had lost all sense of time. It could have been 20 minutes or 2 hours. Everything was cold and white chaos, and the desperate need to keep moving, keep the cattle grouped, keep heading north toward salvation they couldn't yet see. Lydia never let go. She'd stopped shaking at some point, whether from warming up or from cold so deep she couldn't feel it anymore. Ethan didn't know and was afraid to ask. He just focused on driving, on navigating by instinct through terrain he knew by heart but could barely see. Then, like a miracle, the canyon walls materialized out of the storm, dark rock rising on 3 sides, creating the windbreak he'd been praying they'd find. The cattle sensed the shelter and surged toward it, no longer needing to be driven. Ethan guided Storm into the canyon entrance, making sure the last of the herd was inside before he let himself believe they'd made it. 40 head. He did a rough count, squinting through the snow. Maybe 38. Close enough. Most had survived. "We did it," Lydia said, her voice hoarse from shouting over the wind. "We actually did it." "Not done yet. We still have to get back." But getting back was easier. Storm knew the way home, and without the cattle to manage, Ethan could give the horse his head and trust the animal's instincts. They emerged from the canyon and turned south, the wind now at their backs, pushing them toward the cabin. Halfway home, they found Bella. The mare was standing in the lee of a rock outcrop, looking miserable but unharmed. Ethan grabbed her lead, and they continued on, 3 survivors fighting their way through the storm. When the cabin lights finally appeared through the snow, Ethan felt something break loose in his chest, relief so profound it was almost painful. They made it to the stable first, got the horses inside and unsaddled. Ethan worked with hands so numb he could barely feel the buckles, but he got it done, got the animals dried and fed, while Lydia leaned against the wall, her eyes half closed with exhaustion. Then they stumbled across the yard one final time and fell through the cabin door into warmth and safety. For a long moment, they just stood there, dripping melted snow onto the floor, too exhausted to move. Then Lydia started laughing, not hysterical laughter, but the deep, genuine laughter of someone who'd faced death and survived. Ethan found himself laughing too, the absurdity of it all hitting him. They'd known each other for less than 4 hours, and they'd just fought through a blizzard together to save cattle she'd never seen. "We're insane," Lydia said, still laughing. "Both of us. Completely insane." "Probably," Ethan agreed, "but the herd's alive. Because you listened to me. Because you were right." He moved to the fireplace, began building up the fire with shaking hands. "You were right, and I almost dismissed you because you were new. I won't make that mistake again." Lydia was quiet for a moment, and when he looked over, she was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "What?" You asked me at the station if I thought we were running or choosing. I think I have my answer now. And? We're choosing. She moved to stand beside him, holding her hands out to the growing fire. Anyone can run away. It takes something else to ride into a blizzard together. Outside, the storm reached its full fury, winds shrieking around the cabin with enough force to make the walls shudder. But inside, the fire blazed warm, and two people who'd been strangers that morning stood side by side, learning what it meant to trust someone with your life. The storm raged for 3 days without mercy. By the second morning, snow had drifted halfway up the cabin windows, transforming the glass into walls of white that turned daylight into a dim, spectral glow. The wind never stopped, a constant howl that invaded dreams and made conversation difficult even inside the thick log walls. Ethan had to dig a tunnel to reach the stable twice a day, crawling through packed snow to feed and water the horses, while Lydia kept the fire burning and rationed their supplies with the careful precision of someone who understood they were completely cut off from the outside world. They fell into a rhythm born of necessity. Ethan would wake first, build up the fire from its overnight embers, then make the treacherous journey to the stable. Lydia would have coffee ready when he returned, along with whatever breakfast she'd managed to create from their limited stores. They'd eat mostly in silence, conserving energy, then spend the day doing the small tasks that kept survival from becoming disaster, mending clothes, checking for leaks in the roof, monitoring their remaining firewood and food supplies. At night, they'd sit by the fire and talk. Those conversations revealed more than any courtship could have. Without the distractions of normal life, without anywhere to go or anything to do except survive, they learned each other in ways that felt both intimate and strangely formal. Lydia told him about growing up in Boston, about her father who'd been a clerk and died when she was 16, about her mother who'd followed him 2 years later, leaving Lydia alone to make her way in a city that had little patience for unattached women. She told him about the dress shop where she'd worked for 6 years, about the quiet satisfaction of creating beauty with needle and thread, about the slow death of hope as year after year passed without any real prospect of a different future. Ethan told her about his childhood on a farm in Ohio, about parents who'd loved the land but never quite made it pay, about watching them work themselves to death, trying to hold on to something that wanted to slip away. He told her about leaving at 18 with nothing but anger and determination, about the years of hiring on at different ranches, learning the hard way what worked and what didn't, saving every spare dollar until he had enough to buy this land that nobody else wanted. "Why Montana?" she asked on the second night, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea made from herbs she'd found in his supplies. "Why not somewhere easier?" "Because easy land costs more than I could afford. And because," he paused, trying to articulate something he'd never quite put into words, "because hard land doesn't lie to you. It tells you right up front what it's going to take. No false promises. Unlike people. Unlike some people." He looked at her across the firelight. "You haven't lied to me yet." "Neither have you." She smiled slightly. "Though you probably should have warned me that saving cattle in a blizzard would be part of my first day here. Would you have come if I'd mentioned it in the letters?" "I don't know. Maybe not." She set down her cup. "But I'm glad I did it, even if my hands still hurt from holding on so tight." Her hands did hurt. He could see her flexing them carefully, working out the stiffness from those desperate hours clinging to him on the horse. There were other injuries too, small ones they were both pretending weren't serious. A bruise on her shoulder where she'd slammed into the stable wall, frostbite on 2 of his fingers that had turned the tips white and numb. The kind of damage that happened when you push too hard in conditions that didn't forgive mistakes. But they'd survived. The herd was safe in the Windbreak Canyon. The horses were secure, and the two of them were learning that partnership meant more than sharing space. It meant trusting someone else's judgment even when your own instincts screamed otherwise. On the third day, Lydia woke feeling wrong. She didn't say anything at first, just moved a little slower than usual, her face pale in the firelight. Ethan noticed but didn't comment, giving her the dignity of privacy. But when she stood up from the table after breakfast and swayed, catching herself on the chair back, he was beside her in an instant. "I'm fine," she said automatically. "You're not fine. Sit down." "I just stood up too fast." "Lydia." He kept his voice gentle but firm. "Sit down and let me look at you." She sank back into the chair, and he saw the relief in her expression, the admission that she'd been hiding discomfort, maybe pain, and was grateful to stop pretending. He knelt beside her, studying her face in the better light near the window. Her eyes were too bright, her cheeks flushed despite the morning chill. When he pressed the back of his hand to her forehead, the heat radiating from her skin made his stomach drop. "You're burning up." "It's just the fire." "No." He stood, mind racing through possibilities. Fever could mean a dozen things, some minor, some deadly. In a town, you'd call a doctor. Out here, 12 miles from help in the middle of a blizzard, you handled it yourself or you watched someone die. "Where does it hurt?" "My shoulder, where I hit the wall. It's been sore, but this morning it's—" She tried to rotate the joint and gasped, pain flashing across her face. "It's worse." Ethan helped her remove her dress layer by layer until he could see the injury. What had been a bruise 3 days ago was now swollen and angry, red streaks radiating from the impact site. Infection. The word screamed in his mind with the clarity of certain disaster. "Why didn't you tell me it was this bad?" "I didn't want to worry you, and I thought it would get better on its own." She looked down at the wound, and he saw fear creep into her expression for the first time since she'd arrived. "That's bad, isn't it?" "It's infected. We need to treat it now." He moved to his medical supplies, a small box he kept for emergencies, containing bandages, carbolic acid, needle and thread for stitching, and a bottle of whiskey for sterilization and pain. Not much, but it would have to be enough. He heated water on the stove, added a careful measure of carbolic acid to make an antiseptic solution, then returned to where Lydia sat with her shoulder exposed, her jaw set against the pain. "This is going to hurt," he warned. "I know." He cleaned the wound as gently as he could, but there was no gentle way to scrub infection from damaged tissue. Lydia went white, her breath coming in sharp gasps, but she didn't cry out. When he was satisfied he'd done what he could, he applied a poultice of herbs and clean cloth, binding it tight against her skin. "You need to rest. Keep the shoulder elevated. Drink water, as much as you can stand. The fever will get worse before it gets better." "How much worse?" He didn't answer right away, and his silence told her what his words wouldn't. "Ethan, how much worse?" "I don't know. Infections are unpredictable. Could break in a day or two. Could—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "Could kill me." She said it matter-of-factly, but he heard the tremor underneath. "That's what you're not saying." "I won't let that happen." "You might not have a choice." "There's always a choice." He helped her to the bed, the small alcove that had been his alone until 3 days ago. "I could try to ride to town, get the doctor." "In this storm? You'd freeze to death before you made it halfway." "Maybe, but if you get worse—" "If I get worse, you being dead too won't help either of us." She settled back against the pillows, wincing as the movement jarred her shoulder. "We treat it here. Together. And if the fever wins—" She paused, seemed to gather courage. "If the fever wins, you did everything you could. Don't carry that guilt." "Lydia, promise me, Ethan, don't blame yourself for bringing me here if this goes wrong. I made my own choice." He looked at her lying there, this woman who'd been a stranger 4 days ago, and who now felt like something essential to his survival, and made a promise he had no intention of keeping. "I promise." She smiled, seeing through him, but let it pass. "Good. Now tell me what I need to do to help my own recovery." The fever climbed through the afternoon and into the night. Ethan stayed beside the bed, changing the poultice every few hours, forcing water between her lips when she was lucid enough to drink, bathing her face with cool cloths when the heat grew too intense. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes aware enough to speak, sometimes lost in fevered dreams where she called out names he didn't recognize and fought invisible demons. Outside, the storm finally began to break. The wind that had screamed for 3 days dropped to a steady blow, then to occasional gusts, then to silence so profound it felt like a presence in the room. Snow stopped falling. Stars appeared in gaps between the clouds. Ethan barely noticed. His world had contracted to the space beside the bed, to the rise and fall of Lydia's chest, to the heat of her skin under his hand as he checked her temperature again and again, praying for some sign of improvement, Near midnight, she woke fully for the first time in hours. Her eyes were clear, more focused, though still bright with fever. "Still here," she whispered. "Still here." He offered her water, and she drank, a good sign. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by your cattle." She managed a weak smile. "But alive. The fever hasn't broken yet." "I know. I can feel it." She was quiet for a moment, gathering strength. "Tell me something true, Ethan." "What do you mean?" "Tell me something you've never told anyone else. Something real. I need—" She struggled to articulate it. "I need to remember there's a reason to fight through this. That there's something real waiting on the other side." Ethan was silent for a long moment, her request stirring up truths he'd buried so deep he'd almost forgotten they existed. "I never wanted to be alone," he said finally. "People think I came out here because I'm a loner, because I prefer solitude to company. But the truth is I came here because I was afraid. Afraid of trying to connect with someone and failing. Afraid of being rejected or abandoned or just not being enough." He stared at his hands. "It's easier to be alone by choice than alone because nobody wants you." "That's not true." Her voice was soft but certain. "I want you." The words hit him like a physical blow. "Lydia, not because I have no other options, not because I'm desperate or trapped or settling." She reached for his hand with her good arm, her fingers weak but insistent. "I want you because in 4 days you've been more honest with me than William was in a year, because you listened when I had an idea instead of dismissing me, because you're sitting here taking care of me when you could be protecting your own interests." Her grip tightened. "Because you're real, Ethan, and real is what I've been searching for my entire life." He couldn't speak, couldn't find words adequate to the moment. So instead he did the only thing that made sense. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, a gentle touch that conveyed everything he couldn't say. She closed her eyes, a tear sliding down her temple. "Don't let me die before I get to know you better." "You're not going to die." "Promise me something else then." "Anything. If I make it through this, if the fever breaks and I survive, ask me again. About staying or leaving, about what we're building here." She opened her eyes, held his gaze. "And I'll give you a real answer, not based on desperation or fear or lack of options, but based on choice." "All right." He squeezed her hand. "I'll ask." She nodded and drifted back into restless sleep, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts and the terrible waiting that comes with watching someone fight a battle you can't help them win. The fever broke near dawn. Ethan woke from a doze in the chair beside the bed to find Lydia's skin cool under his touch, her breathing deep and even, her face peaceful in real sleep rather than fever-driven unconsciousness. Relief hit him so hard he had to brace himself against the bed frame, his own breathing suddenly ragged. She was going to live. He let himself believe it slowly, checking her temperature again, watching the steady rhythm of her chest rising and falling, looking for any sign that this was temporary reprieve rather than true recovery. But the evidence was clear. The infection had lost its grip, and her body had won the war. Ethan stood on shaking legs and moved to the window, pushed aside the curtain to look out at the transformed world. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind a landscape of white so pure and bright it hurt to look at. Drifts reached halfway up the cabin walls. The path to the stable had disappeared entirely. But the sky was clear, impossibly blue, and sunlight sparked off the snow like scattered diamonds. 4 days. 4 days since Lydia had stepped off that train, and in that time they'd fought a blizzard, saved his herd, and faced death together. 4 days that felt like a lifetime compressed into hours. He heard her stir behind him and turned to find her awake, watching him with clear eyes. "The storm's over," he said. "I can tell. The quiet is almost louder than the wind was." She tried to sit up, winced, and he was there immediately, helping her arrange pillows behind her back. "How long was I out?" "About 18 hours. The fever broke around dawn." "And the shoulder?" He checked the bandage, was relieved to see the angry redness had faded to normal bruising. "Better. Still needs care, but you're past the worst." She nodded, absorbing this. Then, with what looked like considerable effort, she smiled. So I survived my first Montana blizzard and my first Montana infection. What's next? Rest. Food. Healing. He sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted now that the crisis had passed. And when you're strong enough, we dig out. Dig out? The cabin, the stable, the paths between. Probably take a few days of work. He gestured to the window. There's at least 4 feet of snow out there, maybe more in the drifts. And the cattle? I'll check on them tomorrow, but the windbreak should have protected them. We'll know soon enough. He paused. But before any of that, I need to ask you something. The question you promised to ask. Yes. He met her eyes, saw understanding there and recognition of what this moment meant. You said if you survived, I should ask again about staying or leaving, about what we're building. So I'm asking, Lydia, now that you've seen what this life really is, now that you've nearly died for it, do you want to stay? She didn't answer immediately, and in the silence, Ethan felt his heart hammering against his ribs. This was it, the moment of truth they'd been building toward since she stepped off that train. The moment when she'd either commit to this impossible partnership or admit it had been a beautiful mistake. I nearly died saving your cattle, she said finally. Cattle I'd never seen before that night. Do you know why I insisted we go out in that storm? Because you understood what losing them would mean. No, I mean, yes, that was part of it, but mostly I insisted because I needed to know if you'd listen to me. If when I had an idea, even one that seemed crazy, you'd take me seriously enough to consider it. She shifted slightly, testing her shoulder's range of motion. William never listened. Not once in the year we were engaged. He made every decision, dismissed every suggestion I made, treated me like a pretty ornament he was doing a favor by marrying. I swore I'd never put myself in that position again. And you listened. You argued yes, but you heard me. You weighed my words against your experience and made a decision based on merit, not gender. That's worth more than safety, Ethan. That's worth risking everything for. Hope kindled in his chest, but he forced himself to wait, to let her finish. I'm staying, she said clearly. Not because I have nowhere else to go, though that's true. Not because I'm afraid to try again in Boston, though I am. I'm staying because in 4 days you've shown me more partnership than I've experienced in 26 years of living, and I want to see what we can build if we have more than 4 days, if we have a lifetime. The relief that flooded through him was so intense it felt like pain. You're sure? I'm terrified. But yes, I'm sure. She reached for his hand. Are you sure? Because I nearly died, Ethan. I'm not frontier hardy. I don't know how to ranch or farm or survive out here. I might be more liability than asset. You rode into a blizzard to save animals you'd never met because you understood what they meant to our future. You rationed food and kept the fire going while I was dealing with the stock. You faced infection and fever without falling apart. He squeezed her hand. You're exactly the kind of partner I need. The question is whether I'm what you need. You stayed beside my bed for 18 hours. You cleaned an infected wound even though it hurt me. You promised not to blame yourself if I died, and I know you wouldn't have kept that promise because you're not the kind of man who abandons responsibility. Her voice softened. You're what I need, Ethan Cole. You're real, and you're honest, and you listen. That's more than enough. They sat in silence for a moment, hands clasped, the weight of their decision settling around them like the snow outside, transformative and complete. So what happens now? Lydia asked finally. Now you rest. I'll make breakfast, check on the horses, start planning how we dig out. He stood, reluctant to break contact, but knowing she needed to conserve strength. When you're healed and the weather clears, we ride into town and find the minister. Make this partnership legal. A real marriage. If that's what you want, it is. She settled back against the pillows, her eyes already drifting closed with exhaustion. But not just a legal arrangement, Ethan. A real partnership. Equal voice in decisions. Shared work, shared future. Agreed. He pulled the blankets up around her. Sleep now. We have time to work out the details. But before he could step away, her hand caught his wrist. One more thing. Yes? The next time I have a crazy idea about riding into a blizzard, feel free to argue harder. I don't need you to agree with everything I say. I just need you to take me seriously while we discuss it. Despite everything, the exhaustion, the fear, the weight of the commitment they'd just made, Ethan laughed. Deal. He left her sleeping and moved through the cabin, building up the fire, preparing breakfast, beginning the endless work of survival that defined frontier life. But everything felt different now. The silence wasn't lonely anymore. The work wasn't solitary. Even the cabin itself seemed warmer, more like a home than a shelter. Outside, the world sparkled with fresh snow and new possibility. The storm had tested them, and they'd survived, not unscathed. Lydia still wore bandages, and his frostbitten fingers might never fully recover, but together, stronger for having faced it side by side. Later that morning, Ethan made the trek to the Windbreak Canyon to check on the herd. The journey took twice as long through the deep snow, and he had to dig Storm out of the stable and break trail the entire way. But when he finally reached the canyon, his heart lifted at the sight of cattle alive and moving, their breath steaming in the cold air. He did a count. 37 head. They'd lost 3. Better than he'd dared hope given the severity of the storm. The survivors were thin and exhausted but alive, and as he rode among them, he felt pride swell in his chest. This herd represented 5 years of work, of sacrifice, of building something from nothing. And now it also represented proof that Lydia's instinct had been right, that listening to her had saved his future. Their future, he corrected himself. Not his alone anymore. When he returned to the cabin hours later, exhausted and frozen but satisfied, he found Lydia awake and sitting at the table. She'd managed to dress herself in a clean shift and was attempting to comb her hair with her good arm, the injured shoulder still bound tight. "You shouldn't be up," he said automatically. "I was tired of lying down." She set down the comb. "How are they?" 37 survived, 3 lost. Her face fell. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. We expected to lose half. You saved 17 head, Lydia. 17 cattle that represent years of work and thousands of dollars in value." He hung up his coat, moved to warm his hands by the fire. "You saved the ranch." "We saved it. Together." "Yes." He turned to look at her, this woman who'd come into his life like a storm herself, upending everything he thought he knew about solitude and partnership. Together. That night they sat by the fire again, but the conversation was different. Not the careful exploration of strangers anymore, but the planning of partners who'd decided to build something lasting. They talked about spring planting, about expanding the herd, about finishing the cabin's interior and adding a proper second bedroom eventually. They talked about the practical realities of marriage and running a ranch, about division of labor and shared decision-making, about what they'd need to survive, not just the winter, but the years to come. And somewhere in those conversations, between discussions of cattle breeding and garden plots and how to weatherproof the stable better, something shifted. The partnership they'd agreed to began to feel like something more. Not love, not yet. That would come slowly, built through shared work and mutual respect and the thousand small intimacies of daily life. But the foundation of love, the recognition that this person beside you was someone you could trust with everything that mattered. "What day is it?" Lydia asked suddenly. Ethan had to think, counting backwards through the storm days. "Christmas Eve," she laughed softly. "I completely forgot. Some Christmas this turned out to be. We're alive. We have shelter and food and a future. Seems like plenty to celebrate." "I suppose it is." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't have a gift for you." "Neither do I. Wasn't really planning on gift giving this year. Next year, then." She met his eyes across the firelight. "Next Christmas, we'll have gifts and a proper celebration, and maybe," she paused, "maybe we'll have built something beautiful here. Maybe we already have." He stood, crossed to the small chest where he kept his important papers. Inside, beneath the deed to his land and the few family letters he'd saved, was a document he'd prepared weeks ago before Lydia had even boarded the train east. He pulled it out and brought it back to the fire. "What is that?" "A deed to half of this land." He handed it to her, watched her eyes widen as she read the carefully written words. "I had it drawn up in town before I met your train. I thought if we were going to be partners, it should be a real partnership, equal stakes." Ethan, this is... She looked up at him, tears bright in her eyes. This is your life's work. You can't just give me half. I'm not giving it to you. I'm sharing it with you. There's a difference. He sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. You asked for equal voice in decisions. This makes it legal. Whatever we build together. Whatever we lose together. No backing out, no holding back, full partnership. She stared at the document, her fingers trembling slightly as they traced the words. This is the most terrifying thing anyone has ever offered me. Terrifying how? Because it means I can't fail just myself anymore. If I make a mistake, it costs both of us. If I can't handle this life, I'm not just running away from my own dream. I'm abandoning yours too. Or, Ethan said gently, it means you're not carrying the burden alone. Your successes are mine too. Your struggles are mine too. We face everything together, which means neither of us has to be strong enough for this on our own. We just have to be strong enough together. Lydia was quiet for so long he thought maybe he'd made a mistake, pushed too hard, offered too much too soon. But then she set the deed carefully on the table and turned to face him fully. Ask me, she said. Ask you what? Ask me to marry you, properly, not as a business arrangement or a practical solution to loneliness. Ask me because you want me as your partner in every sense, because you believe we can build something real. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. This was it, the commitment they'd been dancing around since the moment she stepped off that train, the choice to stop running and start building, the decision that would define the rest of their lives. He took her good hand in both of his. Lydia Moore, will you marry me? Will you share this land and this life and this future, whatever it brings? Will you fight blizzards with me and save cattle and argue about crazy ideas and build something that lasts? Will you be my partner, my equal, my wife? Her answer was immediate and sure. Yes. They married on Christmas morning in the cabin, with no witnesses except the winter sun streaming through the small window and the crackling fire that had kept them alive through the storm. There was no minister. The 12 miles to town remained impassable, buried under snow that would take weeks to clear. No rings, no flowers, no music except the wind whispering through the eaves. But Ethan had found his father's old Bible in the bottom of his trunk, its pages yellowed and soft with age, and they spoke their vows to each other with hands clasped and voices steady. I, Ethan Cole, take you, Lydia Moore, to be my wife and partner. I promise to listen when you speak, to trust your judgment, to share equally in the work and the rewards of this life we're building. I promise to stand beside you in storms and sunshine, in hardship and plenty, for as long as we both live. Lydia's voice was quieter, but just as firm, her injured shoulder still bound, but her back straight and her eyes clear. I, Lydia Moore, take you, Ethan Cole, to be my husband and partner. I promise to bring my full self to this marriage, to work as hard as you work, to speak honestly even when it's difficult, to build something lasting with you. I promise to stand beside you in whatever comes, to choose you every day, for as long as we both live. There was no one to pronounce them married, so they did it themselves, sealing the commitment with a kiss that was gentle and tentative and real. When they pulled apart, Lydia was smiling through tears, and Ethan felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't even known was unsettled, a sense of rightness that went beyond logic or practicality. So now I'm Mrs. Cole, Lydia said, testing the name. Or I'm Mr. Moore. We could do it that way if you prefer. She laughed, the sound bright in the quiet cabin. No, I like Cole. It sounds strong, like something that can weather storms. We'll need that strength. Ethan moved to the window, looked out at the white landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions. Winter's just starting. We have months of this ahead. Then we'd better get to work. Over the next week, they dug out from the storm's aftermath with the systematic determination of people who understood that survival depended on small victories accumulated daily. Ethan carved paths through the snow, to the stable, to the woodpile, to the root cellar built into the hillside behind the cabin. Lydia, her shoulder healing slowly, took over the interior work, organizing their limited supplies with careful efficiency, mending clothes that had torn during the blizzard, cooking meals that stretched their provisions while keeping them fed and warm. They worked in parallel at first, each focused on their own tasks, but gradually their efforts began to interweave. Ethan would start a path, and Lydia would finish it. She'd begin preparing a meal, and he'd take over when the heavy lifting required two functional shoulders. They developed a rhythm, a wordless communication that came from paying attention to each other's strengths and limitations. On the 8th day after the storm, Ethan made the journey to the Windbreak Canyon again, this time taking Lydia with him. She rode behind him on Storm, her arms wrapped around his waist, and when they crested the rise that revealed the canyon below, he felt her breath catch. "There are so many of them," she said. 37. Pride colored his voice. "More than I've ever had survive a December storm." They descended into the canyon, and Ethan watched Lydia's face as she saw the cattle up close for the first time. Not as dark shapes in a blizzard, but as living animals with distinct personalities and needs. A few of the cows approached cautiously, curious about this new human in their territory. Lydia reached out carefully to touch the nose of one brave heifer, laughing when the animal's warm breath steamed against her palm. "They're beautiful," she said. "They're stubborn and difficult, and they'll kick you if you're not careful. But yes, they're beautiful." Ethan dismounted, helped Lydia down, and began checking the herd systematically, looking for injuries or signs of illness that might have developed during the storm. "We'll need to move them back to the near pasture soon. Can't leave them here indefinitely, not enough forage, and we need to be able to check on them daily." "How long before we can move them?" "Week or two, depending on the weather. Need the trail to be more stable first." He ran his hands along a yearling's flank, checking for weight loss. "In the meantime, we bring them hay every few days, keep them fed until they can graze again." "We?" Lydia smiled at the pronoun. "I like how that sounds." "Get used to it. Everything from here on is we." He straightened, looking around at the herd that represented their shared future. "These cattle are ours now, Lydia. Yours as much as mine. You saved them. You earned them." She was quiet for a moment, her eyes moving across the animals with an expression Ethan couldn't quite read. Then she turned to him with sudden intensity. "Teach me," she said. "Teach you what?" "Everything. How to care for them, how to recognize illness, how to assist with calving when spring comes, how to brand and rope and all of it." She gestured at the herd. "If they're ours, I need to know how to be a proper partner in managing them. I can't just be the person who cooks while you do all the real work." "Cooking is real work." "You know what I mean." Her jaw set with familiar determination. "I didn't come here to be decorative or helpless. I came here to build something, so teach me how." Ethan studied her, this woman who'd stepped off a train 2 weeks ago with no knowledge of ranching and who now stood in a snow-filled canyon demanding to learn everything at once. The smart thing would be to tell her to be patient, to let her shoulder heal fully first, to wait until spring when the work was less brutal. But he'd learned something important about Lydia Moore Cole in their short time together. Telling her to wait was the surest way to make her push harder. "All right," he said, "but we start slow. Your shoulder's still healing, and some of this work is dangerous even for someone with experience." "Agreed. Slow but steady." She looked around the canyon again. "Where do we begin?" They began with the basics. How to approach cattle without spooking them. How to read their body language to anticipate trouble. How to check for common ailments and injuries. Ethan showed her where to feel for temperature changes that might indicate illness. How to examine hooves for damage. What healthy weight looked and felt like versus the dangerous thinness that could develop quickly in winter. Lydia absorbed it all with focused intensity, asking questions that revealed she was thinking 3 steps ahead, already connecting this immediate knowledge to future applications. When they finally rode back to the cabin hours later, the sun setting in streaks of orange and pink across the snow, she was exhausted but exhilarated. "That was incredible," she said as they unsaddled Storm. "I had no idea there was so much to know." "That was just the start. Ranching is 90% observation and 10% action. You learn by watching, by making mistakes, by paying attention to what the animals tell you. Then I'll watch and listen and learn." She helped him carry the saddle to the tack room, moving carefully to protect her shoulder. "How long did it take you to learn all this?" "I'm still learning. Been doing this 15 years and the cattle still surprise me. He hung up the bridle, checked the water trough. But you'll pick it up faster than most. You've got the right instincts. What do you mean? You don't assume you know better than the animal. You watch first, act second. That's more valuable than all the book learning in the world. That night, over a dinner of beans and salt pork that Lydia had somehow made taste almost good, they talked about the future in concrete terms. Spring calving would start in March if they were lucky, April if the winter ran long. They'd need to plan for it now, gather supplies, prepare the birthing shed, make sure they had everything ready for the chaos of new calves and protective mothers. Beyond that, they talked about expanding the herd, about breaking new pasture land in the southern section of the property, about eventually building a proper barn to replace the aging stable. How much would all that cost? Lydia asked. Ethan did calculations in his head, accounting for lumber and labor and the 1,000 small expenses that accumulated. More than we have. Even with a good calving season, it'll be years before we can afford major improvements. What if we had another income source? Like what? I've been thinking. Lydia set down her fork, her expression thoughtful. There's no seamstress in Benson Ridge, is there? No, nearest one is in Helena, 40 miles north. Why? Because ranch wives need clothes mended and dresses made just like city women do. Maybe more, since the work is harder on fabric, and I have those skills. She leaned forward, warming to the idea. I couldn't do much volume, not with ranch work taking most of my time, but a few clients, special orders, repairs, that could bring in cash we could put toward improvements. Ethan considered this. The idea had merit. The women in the territory did their own basic mending, but more complex work, dress alterations, fancy stitching, repairs that required real skill. They either did without or traveled to Helena when they could afford it. You'd need supplies, fabric, thread, a proper sewing table. I have some supplies in my bag. Not much, but enough to start. And if the work comes in, the supplies pay for themselves. She smiled. What do you think? Is it crazy? No crazier than riding into a blizzard to save cattle. He reached across the table, took her hand. I think it's smart. I think it's exactly the kind of partnership thinking we need. You build a skill into income, we invest that income in the ranch. The ranch grows stronger. Everyone benefits. Then I'll put the word out next time we can get to town. Maybe start with basic mending, build a reputation, see what happens. We'll put the word out, Ethan corrected. Partners, remember? Her smile widened. Partners. But before they could make it to town, winter had other tests in mind. The cold came in waves through January, each one worse than the last. Temperatures dropped so low that water froze solid within minutes of being drawn from the well. The horses grew shaggy coats and huddled together for warmth. The cattle in the near pasture moved back successfully after the trails cleared, stood in tight clusters, their breath creating clouds of steam that hung in the still air. Ethan and Lydia fought the cold with constant vigilance. They insulated the cabin with extra layers of sod packed against the walls. They kept the fire burning day and night, taking shifts to maintain it through the darkest hours. They made the journey to check on the herd every morning, breaking ice in the water troughs, distributing hay, watching for signs that an animal was in trouble. On the last day of January, they lost their first cow to the cold. Ethan found her in the morning, frozen stiff near the edge of the pasture where she'd wandered during the night. A young heifer, one he'd hoped would be a strong breeder come spring. The loss hit harder than it should have. He'd lost animals before, knew it was part of the brutal mathematics of ranching. But this one felt different. This one felt like failure. Lydia found him standing over the frozen carcass, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists inside his gloves. I should have brought them closer, he said, without looking at her. Should have built better shelter. You did everything you could. She moved to stand beside him, her breath frosting in the air. Some things you can't prevent, Ethan. Some losses are just the price of living this life. Easy to say when it's not your 5 years of work lying dead in the snow. The words came out harsher than he intended, and he saw her flinch. But instead of retreating, she turned to face him directly. It is my work. That deed you gave me makes it legal, but even without it, these cattle are mine now too. Her death is my loss as much as yours. Her voice was firm, cutting through his anger with simple truth. So yes, we lost one, but we saved 36 others. We fought through the worst winter storm in years and kept them alive. We're winning, Ethan. Don't let one death make you forget that. He looked at her standing there, snow settling on her shoulders, her face red with cold but her eyes blazing with conviction, and felt the anger drain away, replaced by something that might have been love. "You're right," he said quietly. "I know I am." She linked her arm through his. "Now let's get her moved before the wolves find her, and then we go back to the cabin and warm up before we both freeze solid, too." They worked together to drag the carcass away from the pasture, to a gully where scavengers could claim it without endangering the rest of the herd. Hard work, made harder by the cold and the weight of the frozen animal, but they managed it, their combined strength enough for the task. When they finally returned to the cabin, both exhausted and half-frozen, Lydia made coffee while Ethan built up the fire. They sat in silence for a while, thawing out, processing the loss in their own ways. "How many more do you think we'll lose?" Lydia asked finally. "Hard to say. Could be none. Could be half the herd if we get another major storm." Ethan stared into the fire. "That's the gamble of ranching. You do everything right and still lose. You make mistakes and somehow survive. There's no guaranteed outcome." "That's the gamble of everything." She set down her cup. "Marriage, moving west, trying to build a life in an unforgiving place. No guarantees, just choices and effort and hope." "You sound very philosophical for someone who's been ranching for less than 2 months." "I sound like someone who's learned that control is an illusion. The only thing we can control is how we respond." She moved to sit beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "We lost a cow today. That's sad and it's frustrating and it costs us money we can't spare. But we still have 36 others. We still have each other. We still have this ranch and this life and the chance to keep building. Seems like we're still ahead." Ethan turned to look at her, this woman who'd transformed from a frightened stranger on a train platform into a partner who could match him strength for strength, hope for hope. "When did you get so wise?" "Somewhere between freezing to death on a horse and fighting off infection. Surviving changes your perspective." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Makes you appreciate what you have instead of mourning what you've lost." They sat like that as the fire burned down and the cold pressed against the walls and the winter night settled over the valley. Outside, the temperature continued to drop, and the cattle huddled together in the darkness. Their survival depended on instinct and luck, and the care of 2 people who checked on them every morning, despite frozen fingers and aching muscles. February brought a thaw, brief but merciful. The temperature climbed above freezing for 3 consecutive days, and the snow began to melt, revealing brown grass beneath and turning the paths to the stable and pasture into rivers of mud. Ethan and Lydia used the reprieve to make their long-delayed trip to town, loading the wagon with items to sell or trade. 3 winter hides from animals that hadn't survived, butter Lydia had churned from the milk of their 1 dairy cow, excess firewood they could spare now that the worst seemed past. Benson Ridge looked different under winter's retreating grip. The main street was a sea of mud churned by wagon wheels and horse hooves. Merchants had their doors open for the first time in weeks, airing out stores that had been sealed against the cold. People moved with the slow purpose of those emerging from hibernation, greeting each other with relief that they'd all survived another Montana winter. The general store owner, a weathered man named Henderson, greeted them with genuine warmth. "Cole, heard you made it through the big storm. Lost any stock?" "Just 1 so far. Heifer, late January." Ethan began unloading their goods. "Could have been worse." "Could always be worse." Henderson's eyes slid to Lydia with open curiosity. "And this must be the bride everyone's been talking about." "Lydia Cole," Ethan said, putting slight emphasis on the surname. "My wife and partner." "Ma'am," Henderson tipped his hat. "Welcome to Benson Ridge, brave woman, coming out here in December." "Or foolish," Lydia said with a slight smile. "Time will tell which." The store owner laughed, and over the next hour, as they traded goods for supplies and cash, word spread through town that Cole had brought home a wife. People found excuses to visit the general store, to catch a glimpse of the woman who'd apparently ridden into a blizzard her first night in the territory and survived infection that should have killed her. Anne Reed arrived with two of her children in tow, her face bright with delight. "Lydia, Thomas told me Ethan had finally done it, but I didn't quite believe until now." She pulled Lydia into an enthusiastic hug that made Ethan wince on his wife's behalf. The shoulder was healed but still tender. "You must come to dinner, both of you, this Sunday, if the weather holds." "We'd love to," Lydia said, returning the hug carefully. "Though I should warn you, I'm still learning to cook properly for this climate. Everything I make comes out different than it did in Boston." "Then you need a friend who can teach you." Anne linked arms with Lydia, drawing her away from the men toward a quieter corner of the store. "Tell me everything. How did you meet? What made you decide to come all this way? And how in heaven's name did you survive that December storm?" Ethan watched them go, feeling something settle in his chest. Lydia needed friends, needed connection beyond just him. The isolation that he'd grown accustomed to could be poison for someone used to city life, and having Anne Reed as an ally could make the difference between Lydia thriving or slowly breaking under the loneliness. Thomas Reed appeared at his elbow, grinning. "She's spirited," he said. "Anne approves already, I can tell." "Spirited is one word for it." Ethan accepted the cup of coffee Henderson offered. "Stubborn might be another, brave definitely. We rode out in the December storm to move the herd to the windbreak. She insisted on coming." Thomas whistled low. "That's either the bravest or craziest thing I've heard in years." "Both, probably, but we saved 37 head because of it." "Then I'd say you chose well, my friend." Thomas clapped him on the shoulder. "A partner who'll face a blizzard with you is worth more than gold." They completed their business in town, and Lydia spread word through Anne and the other women about her sewing services. By the time they loaded the wagon to head home, she'd already secured 3 commissions: a dress alteration, a wedding quilt that needed detailed stitching, and repairs on a rancher's wife's Sunday coat. "That's more work than I expected," she said as they drove out of town. "I thought maybe 1 or 2 people might be interested." "You're offering something people need, and Anne Reed vouching for you carries weight. If she says you're skilled, people believe it." Ethan guided the horses carefully through the mud. "Think you can handle 3 commissions plus ranch work?" "I'll have to. We need the money." She was quiet for a moment. "How much did we make today from the trading?" $40 after accounting for what we bought. Add the 3 commissions and we're looking at maybe 75 total, depending on the work. That's enough to buy lumber for the barn expansion you mentioned. Some of it, not all. He didn't want to dampen her enthusiasm, but honesty was the foundation they'd built on. "But it's a start. Few more months like this and we'll have enough saved to begin building." The thaw lasted another 2 days, then winter returned with a vengeance. Not a storm this time, but the deep, settled cold that sank into bones and stayed there. The kind of cold where steel shattered if struck wrong, where breath froze in beards, where the constant work of survival left no energy for anything else. Through it all, Ethan and Lydia maintained their rhythm. Morning checks on the herd, afternoon work, his on ranch repairs, hers on sewing commissions hunched near the fire for warmth and light, evening meals and quiet conversation, nights spent sleeping close together for warmth, a practical arrangement that gradually became something more as comfort transformed into intimacy. They lost 2 more cattle in late February, not to cold this time, but to wolves that had grown desperate enough to risk approaching the pasture despite the presence of humans. Ethan tracked them for 2 days, finally driving them off with rifle shots and the sheer force of his anger. Lydia helped him reinforce the fences, stringing extra rope and hanging bells that would alert them to future intrusions. 34 head left, she said, as they worked in the freezing dusk. Still more than you've ever had before. Trying to cheer me up? Trying to remind you that we're winning. She tied off another bell, her fingers clumsy in thick gloves. 3 losses out of 40. That's better than most ranchers manage in a winter this harsh. How would you know what most ranchers manage? I asked Anne. And Henderson? And the other ranchers' wives in town. She moved to the next fence post. I'm learning, Ethan. Learning what's normal, what's success, what's failure. And by every measure, we're succeeding. He stopped working to look at her. This woman who'd arrived knowing nothing about ranching and who now moved through the work with growing confidence, who educated herself through questions and observation, who refused to let setbacks define their progress. I love you, he said. The words surprised them both. They'd never said it before, had been building toward it through actions and choices, but hadn't put voice to the feeling. Lydia went very still, her hand frozen on the fence post. "What?" "I love you." The words came easier the second time. "I didn't plan to say it right now, standing in frozen mud hanging wolf bells, but it's true. I love your stubbornness and your courage, and the way you refuse to let me wallow in defeats. I love that you came here not knowing anything and decided to learn everything. I love that you're my partner in every sense. So, I love you." Lydia was quiet for a long moment, and Ethan felt panic start to rise. Too soon. He'd said it too soon, pushed too hard, mistaken partnership for something deeper that she didn't feel. Then she smiled, brilliant and real. "I love you too, Ethan Cole. I think I have since that night in the blizzard when you listened to my crazy idea and decided to trust me. I think I've been falling in love with you every day since." She dropped the rope she'd been holding and moved toward him. "I was just waiting for you to say it first." He pulled her close, careful of her still healing shoulder, and kissed her properly. Not the gentle touch of their wedding, but something deeper, a claiming and a surrender all at once. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and grinning despite the cold, the sun was setting in streaks of gold across the snow. "We should finish these bells before dark," Lydia said. "Probably." But neither of them moved, content to stand together in the freezing dusk, two people who'd found something they hadn't known they were searching for. That night, their marriage became complete in all ways. Not a practical arrangement anymore, but a true union built on respect and trust, and the kind of love that came from surviving impossible things together. And when they finally fell asleep, wrapped around each other for warmth and comfort both, the cabin felt less like shelter and more like home. March arrived with the first true hint of spring. Not warmth yet, but a softening in the air. A quality of light that promised the winter's grip was finally loosening. The cattle began showing signs of spring too, the pregnant cows growing heavy and restless as their time approached. "First calf could come any day," Ethan said one morning as they checked the herd. "See how she's separating from the others? That's a sign." "What do we do?" Lydia asked. "Watch, wait. Pray it's an easy birth." He moved closer to the cow in question, evaluating her condition. "If we're lucky, nature handles it. If we're not, we assist. Either way, we don't leave her alone once labor starts." They spent the next 2 days in careful vigil, taking turns checking on the expectant mother every few hours. On the third morning, Ethan found her in active labor, straining in the pre-dawn darkness. He ran back to wake Lydia, and together they watched the miracle of new life emerging into their frozen world. The calf came relatively easily, slipping free in a rush of fluid and membrane. The mother licked it clean immediately, her instincts powerful and sure. Within 20 minutes, the baby was struggling to stand on wobbling legs, and within an hour, it was nursing. Ethan and Lydia stood watching in the growing light, their breath steaming, their hearts full. "That's beautiful," Lydia whispered. "That's survival," Ethan corrected gently. "That's our future walking on 4 legs." He put his arm around her shoulders. "First of many, if we're lucky. By April, we could have 15 or 20 calves. That's next year's herd, that's growth, that's success." "We did this," Lydia said wonderingly. "We kept them alive through winter, and now we build from here." He kissed the top of her head. "Together." The calving season that followed brought both triumph and heartbreak in measures that taught them what it truly meant to be ranchers. Over the next 6 weeks, 18 calves were born in their pasture. 14 survived. 4 didn't, lost to complications that even Ethan's experience and Lydia's increasingly skilled assistance couldn't overcome. Each loss hit hard, but they learned to grieve quickly and move on, because the living demanded their full attention and the work never stopped. Lydia proved herself invaluable during those frantic weeks. She learned to recognize the signs of difficult labor, to assist with breech births, to clear airways and stimulate breathing in newborns too weak to start on their own. Her hands, trained to delicate needlework, adapted to the rougher demands of ranch medicine with surprising dexterity. More than once, Ethan watched her coax life into a struggling calf and felt gratitude so profound it bordered on reverence. "You're a natural at this," he told her one morning after they'd successfully delivered twins. a rare and dangerous event that had kept them awake all night. I'm exhausted is what I am. But she was smiling, her face smudged with dirt, and worse, her dress ruined beyond repair. Though I admit there's something miraculous about it, helping life into the world. Even when we lose some? Especially then. She looked out at the pasture where the new calves were beginning to play, testing their legs with the wobbling enthusiasm of the very young. The losses make the survivors more precious. They remind us why we fight so hard. By mid-April, the worst of the calving was done, and they took stock of what they'd built. 34 adult cattle had become 48 total head. 34 adults and 14 calves that would grow into next year's breeding stock or market animals. Not the 50 or 60 that a perfect season might have yielded, but far more than Ethan had managed alone in previous years. "We need to expand the pasture," he said one evening as they sat on the cabin steps watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and rose. 48 head is pushing the limit of what our current grazing can support through summer. How much land would we need to clear? Maybe 10 acres to the south. It's good grassland, just needs the brush cleared and fencing run. He did calculations in his head. 3 weeks of hard work, maybe 4. We'd need to hire help or do it ourselves. We do it ourselves. Lydia's response was immediate. We can't afford to hire out when we have 2 sets of hands and the time. It's brutal work, Lydia. Clearing brush means swinging an axe for hours, digging post holes in rocky ground, lifting fence rails that weigh more than you do. Then I'll swing the axe until my arms give out, and you'll do the heavy lifting, and we'll get it done together. She turned to look at him. We've survived worse than hard work. She was right, and they both knew it. So they began the expansion project with the same systematic determination that had carried them through winter. They worked from dawn until the light failed each day, breaking only for quick meals and water. Ethan chopped while Lydia dragged away brush and piled it for burning. He dug post holes while she carried tools and water. Together they lifted fence rails into place, strung wire tight, built something that would last. The work was every bit as brutal as Ethan had warned. Blisters formed on Lydia's hands despite gloves, then broke and bled and formed again. Her shoulders ached from unaccustomed labor. Her back screamed protest at the end of each day. But she never complained, never suggested they hire help or slow down. She just showed up each morning ready to work, her face set with the same determination that had carried her through blizzards and infection. 3 weeks into the project, disaster struck. Ethan was digging a post hole in particularly stubborn ground when his shovel hit something solid. He assumed rock at first and adjusted his angle, but the next strike revealed something different. Wood, old and rotten. He cleared away more dirt, confusion growing, until he uncovered what looked like the remains of an old root cellar that had collapsed years ago, probably belonging to the homesteader who'd given up on this land before Ethan bought it. "Lydia, come look at this." She joined him in the hole, now waist-deep and widening as they cleared more debris. The cellar had caved in at some point, but parts of the structure remained intact, and as they dug deeper, Ethan's concern grew. This wasn't just a collapsed cellar, it was a sinkhole waiting to happen, the ground beneath unstable and dangerous. "We can't build fence here," he said, frustration coloring his voice. "The whole section is compromised. Fence posts won't hold, and if cattle gather here, the ground could give way. Can we go around it? Not without losing most of what we were trying to gain. The usable pasture was this section specifically." He climbed out of the hole, surveying the area with growing dismay. "We might have just wasted 3 weeks of work." Lydia was quiet for a long moment, studying the exposed cellar with thoughtful intensity. Then her expression changed, excitement replacing concern. "What if we don't go around it? What if we use it?" "Use a collapsed cellar? For what?" "Not as a cellar, as a water catchment." She gestured at the depression, her mind clearly racing ahead. "We're digging anyway. What if we dig it out properly, line it, create a pond? The spring runoff has nowhere to collect right now. It just flows away. But a pond here would provide water for the cattle year-round, would support more head than we could otherwise manage." Ethan stared at her, then at the hole, then back at her. The idea was brilliant and insane in equal measure. Creating a pond would mean weeks more work, would require skills and materials they didn't have, would cost money they couldn't spare. But if it worked, That would change everything, he said slowly. A reliable water source would let us run 60, 70 head, maybe more. And we're already digging. The hard part started. She climbed down into the hole again, began clearing debris with renewed energy. We'd need to line it somehow, clay maybe, and reinforce the banks. But it's possible, isn't it? It was possible. Difficult, expensive in time and effort, risky in a dozen ways, but possible. We'd need help, Ethan said. This is too much for just us. Then we ask for help. Lydia straightened, her face smudged with dirt but her eyes bright. Thomas Reed owes you for helping him repair his barn last summer, doesn't he? And Henderson mentioned he had men who do day labor. We find people willing to work for shares of next year's calf crop, and we build something that lasts. Over the next week, they assembled a crew. Thomas Reed came with 2 of his ranch hands, repaying the debt Ethan had mentioned and bringing expertise in water management that proved invaluable. Henderson sent 2 men from town looking for work, who agreed to labor for future payment in beef. Even Ann Reed appeared with food for the crew and stayed to help with the lighter tasks. Together, they transformed the collapsed cellar into a working pond. They dug deeper, shaping the basin to catch and hold runoff. They lined the bottom with clay, hauled from a deposit 2 miles north, mixing and packing it until it formed a watertight seal. They reinforced the banks with stones and timber, creating stability that would last through seasons of freeze and thaw. The work took another month, pushing them deep into May, but when they finally diverted the spring creek to fill their creation, watching water flow into the pond and settle there, clear and clean and permanent, Ethan felt something shift in his understanding of what they were building. This wasn't just a ranch anymore. It was a legacy. To the coal ranch, Thomas said that evening, raising a cup of whiskey and toast. The crew had gathered for a celebration, a rare moment of leisure after weeks of punishing work. May it prosper for generations. To partnership, Lydia added, meeting Ethan's eyes across the fire they'd built near the new pond. And to the crazy ideas that make impossible things real. They drank and talked, and as the stars emerged overhead, Ethan felt a contentment he'd never experienced before. Not the absence of worry, there were always worries in ranching, but a deep satisfaction in what they'd accomplished together. After the crew departed the next morning, Ethan and Lydia stood by the pond watching their cattle drink from water they'd created through vision and effort. "We did this," Lydia said wonderingly. "We actually did this. You did this. It was your idea. Our idea. I saw the possibility, you made it real." She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. That's how partnership works, isn't it? One person sees, the other builds, and together you create something neither could manage alone. Is that what we're doing, creating something that lasts? I think we already have. She placed her hand over her stomach in a gesture that made Ethan's heart stop. I think we've created several things that will last. He turned to face her fully, hope and fear and joy tangling in his chest. Lydia? I'm not certain yet. It's early, but... She smiled, tentative and radiant. I think by winter there might be 3 of us here instead of 2. The news should have terrified him. Another mouth to feed, another vulnerability in a life already precarious, another way that everything could go wrong. But looking at Lydia's face, seeing the hope and fear mirrored there, all Ethan felt was fierce protective joy. We'll need to finish the 2nd bedroom, he said. She laughed, the sound bright with relief. That's your first thought? Not whether we can afford it, or whether it's safe, or any of the 100 practical concerns? All of those too. But mostly I'm thinking we'll need that bedroom finished before snow falls, and a cradle, and about 1,000 other things I have no idea how to build or provide. He pulled her close. But we'll figure it out, same way we've figured out everything else. Together, she whispered against his chest. Together. The summer that followed was a season of building in every sense. The cattle thrived with access to the pond, growing fat on good grass and abundant water. The calves developed into strong young animals that would fetch good prices come fall. Lydia's sewing business expanded as word spread of her skill, bringing in steady income that they saved carefully for the baby's needs and ranch improvements. They finished the 2nd bedroom, transforming bare walls into a proper space with a window facing east to catch morning light. Ethan built a cradle from pine he cut and planed himself, each piece fitted with the care of someone creating something precious. Lydia sewed blankets and small clothes, her needle flying through fabric during the long summer evenings when the light lasted until nearly 10 o'clock. Anne Reed became a constant presence, bringing advice and baby items her own children had outgrown, teaching Lydia what to expect and how to prepare. The two women formed a friendship that eased Lydia's isolation, giving her the connection to other women that Ethan recognized as essential but couldn't provide. In August, they made the decision to sell 10 of their yearling calves while the market was strong. The money, more than Ethan had ever received from a single sale, went into an account in Benson Ridge for emergencies and future expansion. It was security they'd never had before, a buffer against the disasters that could destroy a ranch in a single season. "We're actually succeeding," Lydia said one evening as they reviewed their finances. "Not just surviving, succeeding." "Don't jinx it," Ethan said automatically, but he was smiling. "I'm not jinxing anything. I'm acknowledging reality." She set aside the ledger where she'd been tracking their income and expenses with meticulous precision. "We started with 40 cattle in desperation. Now we have 53 head counting the calves we kept, a pond that can support 70, money in the bank, and a baby coming. That's success by any measure." She was right, though it felt dangerous to admit it. Ranching had taught Ethan that success was temporary, that disaster could strike without warning, that pride came before catastrophic falls. But looking at what they'd built in less than a year, at the expanded pastures and improved facilities, at the herd that represented their combined effort, at Lydia's growing belly that held their future, he couldn't deny the truth of her words. September brought the first hints of autumn, the nights cooling and the aspens beginning to turn gold on the hillsides. The cattle were in prime condition, and Ethan began preparing for the winter ahead with the systematic planning of someone who'd learned from past mistakes. He stockpiled hay, repaired fences, reinforced the stable against the cold that would inevitably return. Lydia's pregnancy progressed well, though the work became harder as she grew larger. She stopped helping with the heavy ranch tasks by early October, focusing instead on her sewing and the preparation of their home for the baby. Ethan found himself doing twice the work he'd done the previous year, but with none of the loneliness. Each evening, he returned to a warm cabin, a prepared meal, and a woman who asked about his day and shared her own thoughts with the ease of true partnership. The baby came in early November, 3 weeks before they expected, during a light snowfall that felt like a blessing rather than a threat. Anne Reed had come to stay with them for the final month of pregnancy, and her presence proved essential as Lydia's labor progressed faster than any of them anticipated. Ethan paced outside the bedroom door, listening to sounds that terrified and awed him in equal measure, feeling helpless in a way that ranch crises never made him feel. This was beyond his control, beyond his ability to fix or manage, and the waiting was torture. When the baby's first cry finally pierced the air, he nearly collapsed with relief. Anne emerged 20 minutes later, grinning. "You have a son, strong and healthy and loud. Come meet him." Lydia was propped up in bed, exhausted and radiant, holding a bundle that squirmed and fussed with impressive vigor. She looked up as Ethan entered, and the smile on her face made his heart stop. "Come meet our son," she said, echoing Anne's words. Ethan approached slowly, almost afraid, and looked down at the tiny red face peering out from the blankets. His son, their son. A person who existed because two desperate strangers had taken a chance on each other a year ago. "He's perfect," Ethan whispered. "He's wrinkly and loud and perfect," Lydia corrected, laughing through tears. "Do you want to hold him?" He did, though his hands shook as he accepted the bundle. The baby was surprisingly heavy, surprisingly real, and as Ethan stared down at the small face, he felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of what mattered. "What should we name him?" Lydia asked. They'd discussed names but never settled on one, unable to agree or unwilling to commit until they knew who they were naming. But now, holding his son while snow fell softly outside and the woman he loved watched from the bed, one name felt right. "Cole," he said. "After the life we've built here. Cole Thomas, if you approve." "Thomas for Thomas Reed?" He helped save our ranch. Seems right to honor that. Lydia smiled. Cole Thomas Cole. That's quite a name for such a small person. He'll grow into it. Ethan carefully returned the baby to Lydia's arms, just like we grew into this life. Anne stayed another week, helping with the baby and the household tasks while Lydia recovered. Ethan took over all the ranch work, running himself ragged but refusing to complain. This was part of partnership too, carrying the load when your partner couldn't, knowing they'd done the same for you and would again. By the time Anne left, Lydia was back on her feet, though moving carefully and tiring easily. The baby settled into a rhythm of feeding and sleeping that left them both exhausted but adjusting. Winter was coming. They could feel it in the air, see it in the cattle's thickening coats, but this time they were ready. The first major storm of the season arrived in early December, almost exactly a year after Lydia had stepped off that train. As snow began to fall and wind picked up, Ethan secured the animals and the cabin with practiced efficiency. This time there was no panic, no desperate gambles in the dark. They'd learned from the previous year, and their preparation showed. That night, safe in the cabin with the fire burning and the storm raging outside, Lydia nursed the baby while Ethan repaired a harness by lamplight. The domesticity of it struck him suddenly. How far they'd come from those first awkward days when they'd been strangers sharing space. "What are you thinking?" Lydia asked, noticing his expression. "That a year ago we didn't know each other, and now we have a child together, a thriving ranch, a life that works." "It feels like longer than a year." "In some ways, yes. In others," he set aside the harness. "In others, I still can't quite believe you're here, that you stayed." "Where else would I be?" She shifted the baby to her shoulder, patting his back gently. "This is home, Ethan. Not because it's the only option, but because it's the life we chose and built together." "Even with the storms and the losses and all the hard parts?" "Especially because of those." She met his eyes. "The hard parts are what made us partners, what made us real. Anyone can share the easy times. It takes something stronger to share the impossible ones." The storm raged for 2 days, but they weathered it easily, their stockpiled supplies and improved cabin making it merely an inconvenience rather than a crisis. When it finally cleared, Ethan checked on the herd and found them safe in the shelter he'd built, the pond frozen, but the hay he'd distributed keeping them fed. 51 head total now. They'd lost 2 in the fall to predators despite their best efforts, but all accounted for and healthy. By spring, they'd have calves again, would continue building the legacy they'd started. December passed into January with the usual hardships, but none that threatened their survival. February brought a thaw that let them make a trip to town, where they showed off young Cole to the community that had supported them. March brought the first signs of spring and the beginning of another calving season. This time, Lydia couldn't help as much with the births, occupied with caring for a 4-month-old who demanded constant attention. But Ethan managed, drawing on the experience they'd built together, and when complications arose, Lydia talked him through the process from the cabin while nursing the baby. 16 calves were born that spring. 13 survived. The herd reached 64 head, straining their pasture capacity even with the pond expansion. They'd need to make hard decisions soon about selling or acquiring more land, but these were good problems, the problems of success rather than survival. On an evening in late April, Ethan and Lydia sat on the cabin steps watching the sunset, a ritual they'd maintained through all seasons when weather allowed. The baby was asleep inside, the cattle were settled, and the valley was painted in shades of gold and green that promised a summer of plenty. "Do you ever think about that first night?" Lydia asked. "When I stepped off the train and you looked like you might bolt?" "Constantly." Ethan smiled at the memory. "I was so certain I'd made a mistake, that you'd take one look at the cabin and demand the return fare immediately. I almost did. The emptiness terrified me." "What changed your mind?" "You did. The way you were honest about how hard it would be. The way you gave me an out but hoped I'd stay. The way you listened when I had that crazy idea about the cattle." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You made me feel like a partner from the start, even when I knew nothing. That was worth more than safety or comfort or any of the things I thought I wanted." "I think about William sometimes," Ethan admitted. about what might have happened if he hadn't been an ass, if you'd married him instead. Then some other woman would be sitting here with you, and I'd be miserable in Boston wondering what my life might have been. She lifted her head to look at him. But that didn't happen. He was an ass. I came here, we built this life together, and I wouldn't change a single moment of it, even the terrifying parts. Not even the infection that nearly killed you? Not even that. Because you sat beside me for 18 hours and refused to let me die. Because we learned what we meant to each other in that crisis. She took his hand. The hard moments are what prove the good ones are real. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in colors that seemed almost impossible. Around them, their ranch, their home, settled into evening. The cattle lowed softly in the pasture. The horses shuffled in the stable. Inside, their son slept peacefully in the cradle Ethan had built with his own hands. This was what they'd created from nothing. Not just a working ranch, though it was that. Not just a marriage, though it was that too. But a life built on honest partnership, on choosing each other every day, on facing impossible things together and discovering they were stronger than they knew. "I love you," Ethan said, the words coming easier now after months of practice. "I love you too." Lydia squeezed his hand. "And I choose you. Every day for the rest of our lives, I choose you. Even when I'm stubborn and difficult, especially then. You match my stubborn and difficult perfectly." She stood, pulling him up with her. "Now come inside. Our son will be awake soon, and I'd like a few minutes of peace before the chaos starts again." They walked into the cabin together, closing the door against the cooling evening, and Ethan felt a contentment so profound it was almost painful. This life they'd built, this impossible, beautiful, difficult life, was everything he'd never dared hope for. The waiting was over. The loneliness was over. The question of whether anyone would choose him, whether he was enough, whether partnership was even possible for someone like him, all of it was answered. Lydia had chosen him. He'd chosen her. And together they'd built something that would last far beyond either of them alone. Outside, night settled over the valley. The stars emerged one by one, bright and constant in the darkness. The cattle settled for sleep. The land that had tested them so brutally now cradled them gently, yielding to their care and returning it with abundance. And in a cabin that was no longer just shelter but home, a family slept peacefully, their future secured not by certainty or safety, but by the unshakable foundation of two people who decided that together they could face anything. The story that had begun with strangers on a frozen train platform had become something neither of them could have imagined. A partnership forged in crisis, strengthened by choice, and proven by the simple daily act of showing up for each other, no matter what the world threw at them. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.